recording on? Because we've been recording most of these, and why break our string at this point? So anyway, yes, he was a doctor, and so he was a scientist and a rationalist and a man of who transcended cultural boundaries. He was born in Spain, focused. He always lived in the Sephardic world, North Africa, Egypt. He became the doctor there, to royalty in Egypt, and then I believe made it on to the Promised Land at some point, to Palestine. So we're talking about Maimonides for those who've just come aboard. Great question by Barbara. Why is he mentioned? He's certainly not the last half century, but I think his influence goes way beyond the past several decades, and really he's probably the most influential Jewish thinker of all time, philosophically speaking. What's interesting is that he had two great works. One is called The Guide to the Perplexed, which is his philosophical magnum opus. And the other is the Mishnah Torah, which is his halachic magnum opus. The Mishnah Torah, nothing to do with the Mishnah. That's 1,000 years before. It's a rabbinic work. But what he did as a rationalist, as a logical person who just loved to set things in order, was that he took the Talmud, which had lots of laws in it, but lots of decisions, court decisions, etc., and he managed to systematize it, to organize it into categories so that you can, basically look up what are Jewish laws of marriage, what are Jewish laws of kashrut, what are the laws of Shabbat, and you can find them in these separate volumes. It makes things very easy, very simple for us, especially if you're reading Talmud, which really isn't a law book. It's more of a mishmash. It's like, my grandmother's cookbook, which has one page over here and one page torn out over there, and everything is sort of mixed together, but there's no real order to it. And then a lot of handwritten stuff too. Maimonides systematized it. So the Mishnah Torah is a major, major work. He's also the one who counted the 613 commandments and put them in order according to how he was definitely a rationalist. He was a scientist. He was a mathematician too. So you can see that in his work. Somewhat strangely, Maimonides' philosophical work, The Guide to the Perplexed, is much less accessible now, but back in his day, it was the popular work. The Mishnah Torah, which in his day was really sort of a guidebook for rabbis, is basically, closed off to rabbis who would understand all the halachic information and the jargon that's found there. Now, I would say, is the much more accessible work for people now, because especially in translation into English, people can, just get the answers they're looking for. So that's sort of reversed. Now, his thought was based on Greek thought, Aristotle in particular. What made, and that his views on God, especially, and that's where it ties back into today's stuff, especially Art Green. He thought of God very much in abstract terms. He thought of God as the first cause, not as he really did not like anthropomorphism, the whole idea of God being described as almost human, in the concrete, legendary, mythological terms. He thought of God much more as a first cause, but not necessarily being directly involved in the same way that a human-like God would be. So he's very Greek in that sense too, in his thinking. So anyway, that's one of those patented long answers to short questions.
Oh, thank you.
But he was influential. I mean, the answer to your question is he was influential to modern Jewish thinkers, as he has been throughout time. You can count on one hand the philosophers who were as influential as he has been. So that's Maimonides. Okay. So, any other questions before we roll into Arthur Green, and his book, Radical Judaism, is a particular favorite of mine. I did a class on it once when it first came out, 2010. Wasn't that long ago, and it was. I think it was interesting, but what's interesting to me may not be that interesting to others. But what is important in talking about Art Green is that his influence definitely can be felt in progressive Judaism today. His influence and Leonard Fein. So we have these two. That's why I wanted Leonard Fein to be sort of the complementary work. The two of them focus on different areas that are essential to how we would define progressive Judaism. I'm thinking especially about non-Orthodox Judaism. So you have with Art Green a real focus on theology, on environmentalism, with a little bit of social justice thrown in. With Leonard Fein, it's all about social justice. That he was the leader of American Jewry in many ways in social justice. I'm just sort of wondering whether any of you have heard of these people, especially Leonard Fein. Did anyone ever read something called Moment magazine? Okay, Michelle's nodding. That's good. Did you read it a lot? Oh, I can't hear you.
He's muted.
It came to the house. I don't remember anything in particular.
It came to the house.
Yeah.
It came to a lot of houses. In the 1970s, he started Moment magazine, which actually is based on a magazine of similar name, I think the same name, but in Polish, that existed in Poland and Warsaw between the wars. And if you know a little about Polish Jewish history, especially if you've been there, there's a museum, the Polin Museum in Warsaw has the history of the Jewish community there. Jewish life was thriving in Poland and in Warsaw and Ukraine, for that matter, between the wars. It was just like similarly that you see in Berlin, before the rise of Nazism, just the rise of such fascinating cultural trends, a lot of freedom being expressed. And Jews were freer than perhaps ever before to be Jews and just to debate their ideas. And in the Jewish communities there, it was similar to here, but much more intense. Communism, not that Zionism. There was fascism, sort of on the horizon that they had to defend against, anti-Semitism. But the communists, the socialists, the Zionists, the secularists, the Yiddishists, just all of this sort of coming together in fascinating community. And so anyway, Moment magazine was a very popular magazine in Poland then. And then Leonard Fein sort of reinvented it for here in America. And he wanted there to be real dialogue, especially a voice for progressive Judaism. He was Reform, his background was Reform, although he actually, for a time, belonged to my synagogue in Brookline and taught at Brandeis, between Brandeis and Harvard and the Chavurah, which started in Cambridge. And there was, the counterculture was just explosive in that area, in the Boston area where I was growing up. So Leonard Fein was part of that. And he introduced Moment to the Jewish world, and it really had a huge impact, like the Jewish catalog. I've mentioned that before. Just there's a lot going on. So anyway, Leonard Fein became really a hero for the Jewish left. And he saw himself as a leftist, but not in an extreme sense. He was also very much at the forefront of the first protests of Israeli policy that took place among American Jews. That never happened in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Israel was always under siege. Israel hadn't yet conquered the West Bank. There was no occupied territory or anything like that. After 67, when choices began to be made that would create settlements and would create a whole different view of the Palestinians on both sides, because there was also a lot of terrorism going on. Anyway, a lot of American Jews came to protest what they thought were unjust policies of the Israeli government in the mid 70s. And a group was formed called Brera, which means there's a choice. And he was hoping, Leonard Fein, to make a difference along those lines. So anyway, he made a huge difference. But the foundation of his writing, which is beautiful writing, his magazine was a beautiful magazine. It had great articles. It wasn't just philosophy or polemic at all. It was really well done. But his social action was what mattered to him most. I sort of walked in the footsteps of Heschel in that way, although not nearly as influential as Heschel. He created a lot of philanthropic pursuits, but the most famous, is an organization called Mazon. Has anyone ever heard of Mazon? Okay, now we're getting there. We actually still have connection to it. It still exists. Leonard Fein passed away a while back, 2014, but he started Mazon and it became very popular. The idea was to try to transform American Judaism from something that was seen as fairly materialistic. I guess I'm understating that, to taking some of that materialism and giving it spiritual meaning, giving it, and for him, spiritual meant social action, meant helping other people. Tikkun olam, that whole expression of repairing the world. So he did it in a brilliant way. He had a brilliant idea. Does anyone remember how Mazon, how it operated? People made donations now, and they do and did then. But there was another thing that they asked people to do. Okay, ding, time's up. What he proposed was that people take 2 or 3% of the cost of a bar mitzvah party and donate it to provide food for those who have food challenges, those who are hungry. And of course, bar mitzvah parties tend to be rather extravagant. Back in the 70s, I think given the change in the dollar and per capita, I think they were probably more expensive than they are now. And there were more of them. Remember, the baby boom had just really come of age. There were bar mitzvahs all over the place. And there definitely was a perception that it was that they were shallow and materialistic. And the perception was held especially by the counterculture, who wanted to protest against the world of their parents. Even their own bar mitzvahs, they looked back and said, wow, these were shallow and materialistic. You think of movies like Goodbye Columbus, books, Philip Roth's book, but the movie based on it. There are a few with, classic bar mitzvah scenes. And does anyone see the Mrs. Maisel bar mitzvah?
Yeah.
And also the Shrink movie that was on Apple Plus, the one with Paul Rudd. I don't know if you, anyway, there was a bar mitzvah scene there. They've toned it down considerably. Any Jewish show worth its salt will have a bar mitzvah in there at some point. And for Mrs. Maisel, it's pretty hard because the oldest son, Ethan, is not going to be bar mitzvah during the run of that show. Its show is scheduled to end in a couple of years, I think. So they had to find someone else's bar mitzvah, and it was someone that no one knew who it was. And it was sort of weird. And then they end up having a big argument in services. I won't spoil it for you, but for those who saw it, you should know that it actually is a famous Jewish custom, a Jewish practice of airing the community's grievances at services. And the opportunities are given during the Torah reading. It rarely happens, but it's a time to sort of, to deflate the pressure that's, if it's a particularly vexing issue that's going on, to make that a time of frank conversation. And that's what happened. But the Mrs. Maisel bar mitzvah did not have the party.
Right.
You never got to see the party. The characters from the show never made it to the party because they were kicked out, basically. But if you go back to the 70s, there was a show called The Wonder Years, and the Jewish kid in that show, his bar mitzvah was a very famous one.
There was a bar mitzvah, if you remember.
Right? What's that? Roz, did you say? Oh, okay. So yeah.
I don't remember that.
But the most famous bar mitzvahs were the parties. It wasn't the service, which is too bad. So you have all these really outrageous ones, and so that's what happened. In response to it, Leonard Fein created Mazon, 3%, and we had a lot of people here. Eileen, I don't know if you remember, but a lot of people took Mazon as their mitzvah project, and they would actually calculate the cost of their bar mitzvah and give 2 or 3% as a donation to Mazon. We still have Mazon envelopes available on the high holidays on our information table. Every year we get them. They ask us how many we'd like. We say 50. I don't know. I mean, we used to put them on every seat, but people weren't necessarily giving that much. So we always recommend it, though, and it's still an important charity. Anyway, that is Leonard Fein. Okay, so Art Green, not so much concerned about social action, but definitely concerned about progressive issues. So let's look at some of what he wrote. Let's see, I have it here. Okay, you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any videos or other bells and whistles today. We're just going with the good stuff here. And he is, by the way, as it says here, director of the rabbinical school at Hebrew College, which is in Boston, and a non-denominational rabbinical school, something that's increasing. So he makes some comments about the Holocaust, and very common, especially during that period, late 20th century, to really focus on the negativity that's generated by the Holocaust and how it has driven, in their minds, many Jews from active Jewish commitment, particularly young Jews. I've tried to develop the argument in the past couple of years that is changing, and I think we see to this day, every day, that the Holocaust is something that can't be ignored, and in fact has positive ramifications in terms of the Jewish identity that's engendered. But anyway, so he said, to be a Jew is still to think about the right way to live, to be challenged, to respond. How do we live a holy life after the Holocaust with a third of our people dead and so many wounded by cynicism and despair? How do we stand before Sinai as a people that fully includes the voices of women equally with those of men? How do we lift our heads in God's presence in a time when Jews are seen by many, with some justification, as oppressors rather than victims? Our response needs to change shape and grow in each generation as it is confronted with the new and different challenges, but it still faces the same question, Ayeka, where are you? That's the question that God asked Adam in the Garden of Eden. First question, in fact. How are you going to live? When we live badly, especially when we are selfish, mean, or uncaring, we are disgraced before our fellow Jews. A Jew should know better is something we all feel. What is conduct unbefitting a member of the Jewish people? We know it when we see it, and we call it Chilul Hashem, a defaming of God's name. That name we all bear as part of the word Israel. The L, of course, El, is God's name. The echo of covenant is commingled with the memory of Egypt, and the long history of persecution is in telling us when and how a Jew should know better. So he brings in egalitarianism, he brings in women's rights, he talks about ethics, he talks about Menschlichkeit, he talks about the Jewish message. All of these are key to a progressive definition of what it is to be a Jew. He then goes on to say, and he's a fairly traditional Jew, but he says in the middle of the next paragraph, the new Judaism will not be created top-down by committees of rabbis, or, God forbid, by presidents of major Jewish organizations. Yeah, 60s. The halacha, or pathway, of the future will be more flexible, more multi-stranded than any we have known. It will only emerge from a new agadah. That means sort of a legend, the narrative, legendary part of the Talmud, as opposed to the legal sections. A new articulation of Jewish faith that will that succeeds in capturing the hearts of generations of Jews. This narrative will take us back to old tales, but with contemporary eyes and ears wide open. The voice calls forth each day. When we are ready, it will address us. My prayer is that this book constitutes a small step along that evolutionary path. This is the moment for radical Judaism. We understand that all God can do is call out to us, now as always. All we can do is respond or not. The consequence of our failure will be monumental. God is indeed in need of humans, and we humans are in need of guidance, seeking out the hand of a divine partner, one who speaks from deep within the heart, but also from deep within our traditions and its wisdom. Such a time cries out for leadership, for covenant, and for mitzvah, all of them expanded and redefined for this hour. So what do you hear there are sort of the ingredients of this radical Judaism? What are some of the things that he's really getting at here? And we may have come across them before. First of all, where is God in his depiction just now? There is really in the heart, right? Thanks.
Yes,
Yeah. God is within us. Speaks deep within the heart, within the heart. So in our gut instincts, we're in God's image. Tselem Elohim. Remember, Yitz Greenberg talked a lot about image of God. He's Orthodox, but that is a key. Deep within the heart and deep within our traditions and its wisdom. Our tradition and its wisdom, he says. So the collective wisdom of the Jewish people, through what he calls agadah, so not just the laws, not just halacha, but the stories, but the experiences of the Jewish people. So we have the experiences, which is somewhat historical, and he's very much, by the way, scientific in his outlook. He believes in evolution. He thinks evolution and the Big Bang and Darwin are all essential. They're miracles. They're essential to understanding the unfolding of creation. But we have also something of Martin Buber. Remember Martin Buber, I and thou? Where God exists is between people, in relationships. So he talks about something similar, that we humans, we're seeking out the hand of a divine partner. Now, God is speaking from within our heart, but we're also addressing God, and we're also addressing one another, helping one another. So he sort of puts a little bit of each of these together, a little Heschel, a little Buber, maybe a little Aristotle down there somewhere. And definitely a lot of rabbinic Judaism, but again, he says it's not from the top down, but bubbling up from the grassroots. So it's very counterculture. It's very 1960s, very anti-authoritarian, and it takes generations for it to develop. throw in the Holocaust, which he makes mention here, although it comes into play a little bit later in the reading. But he's talking about, the Holocaust as having to be incorporated into this new Judaism that's developing. We have to answer the questions of the Holocaust. He talks about spiritual consciousness, and then he talks about Israel. And that's where we get into the Breira, what I was talking about before, the critiques of Israel and the need for social justice in Israel as well as here, especially in regard to treatment of the Palestinians, etc. So he talks about that. All of that is sort of Art Green's gestalt, his way of looking at the world. Now, I don't know if you had a chance to read the response to Art Green, which is by Daniel Landis, who ran Pardes, the Pardes Institute in Jerusalem. So he's modern Orthodox from an Israeli perspective, and he lashes out at Art Green for not being connected enough in his mind to the love of Israel. Avat Yisrael is the expression that he uses, and really means love of the Jewish people. But Israel, of course, has more than one or two meanings. It could be the love of the state of Israel. And it was a sort of sideways backhanded compliment, insult, a slap at him for not being a little bit more supportive of the state of Israel. And he rejects that. And you can look at it in the reading. I gave you the link. And then the commentary by Samuel Chaim Brody calls this a skirmish, basically, of a modern Orthodox philosopher versus this progressive leader. And they go back and forth. The commentary is not too sympathetic to Art Green, really, but it's not that important that we focus on that so much. One thing that, though, is sort of important. Let me see if I can get to that. On page 311. So you'll take a look at the rest of it. The state of Israel. Here, to read this debate is primarily about interpretation, would, I think, put the cart before the debate is about boundaries. It's about what gets to count as Judaism in the 21st century. For Green and his world, the answer to that question is determined by hunger, meaning looking for meaning. Whereas for Landis and his world, the answer is determined by anxiety. The state of Israel does not inspire liberal American Jews Jewishly, but it does assuage the anxiety of many Israeli and American Jews about the prospects of Jewish survival. What Landis does in his critique of Green is elide physical survival and spiritual survival by nearly imperceptibly eliding the people of Israel into the state. And I've talked about love of Israel, love of Jews versus the love of the state of Israel. I think it's an interesting question. Just although it's not necessarily central to understanding Art Green, but loving the state of Israel and finding meaning in it is much harder for progressive Jews whose Jewish meaning stems from Jewish experiences, Jewish memories, Jewish ethics. And here we see ethics that challenge us from Israel. But what he's saying is that that's not really what motivates American Jews' love for Israel. Not so much those dreams or those hungers, but anxieties. And we see that actually come into play the last 2 weeks. That's why I thought this paragraph was interesting, last month, with the situation with Ukraine, specifically Jews leaving Ukraine who have an Israel to go to.
That's what I felt. I told my sister.
Yeah. I mean, even if we have issues with Israel, the fact that there's an Israel to go to, when you see, although other countries like Poland are doing amazingly letting in refugees, here's a country that's going to say, if you're Jewish, now maybe we're being a little bit, selective. I hate that term, but yeah, maybe, but we're favoring one, but that's because that's our family. If you're Jewish, you have a home here. If you have one Jewish grandparent and you're not Jewish, one Jewish grandparent, you have a home here. If you're not Jewish, it's been really hard for Ukrainians to get into Israel. Ross?
Yes, I one thing I've wondered about, many of the refugees who are going to Poland and Romania, I believe will come back to Ukraine if it's rebuilt. But I wonder about the Jews who are going to Israel. Will they, is this like making an unthought about Aliyah and just stay as Israelis, once they're there for a few years?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a good case on both sides. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts. Remember, all the Jews who are now going to Israel could have gone to Israel for the last 30 years. There's nothing holding them back from moving to Israel. So, and 30 years ago, in the early 1990s, after the Berlin Wall and everything, hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews moved to Israel, a million, including many from Ukraine. So some families did, some families didn't. The Zelensky family, for instance, stayed in Ukraine, and they made a life in Ukraine. I'm just, the whole thing with Zelensky has made me rethink everything. I think it's causing a lot of Israelis' anxiety. Just a little aside, but I like these asides, you know that.
Yes.
He spoke at the Knesset this week. I don't know whether you followed that. He didn't really speak at the Knesset. They were on. It's one thing to say that the Knesset was out of town, but Israel's not a big town. They can all come back, and they could have all been in the same room to give him a standing ovation, as Congress did, so that when he's calling out from his bunker, he would see his brothers and sisters, the Jewish people, standing. There was a group in Tel Aviv, in Habima Square, several thousand people who watched, and so you could see them clapping. But in Knesset, no, they were all on Zoom. Now, I love Zoom, but you have 120 boxes like this, and then one box pops in Zelensky.
Do you
Michelle?
think that was a slight, an intentional slight, not to have them come and be together as they did in other countries like the U.S. and Canada? And
I didn't at first, but I do now, and I think it's partly because they've been trying so hard to appear neutral, so that they could be, they could be brokers between Russia and Ukraine, which Zelensky sort of wanted Israel to maybe be in that position. But the real reason, Israel says, is because Russia controls Syria right now, and it would be really messy for Israel to upset the Russians and not be able to fly over Syria to destroy armaments that are heading toward Hezbollah. It's a complicated neighborhood. I could get it, but that was a month ago. I don't get it now. And what happened on Sunday convinced me that I'm right. I don't get it, and I think now I do get it. Actually, they have very mixed feelings towards Zelensky. It's strange. The whole world is cheering him on. He is a hero. He's a Jewish hero. He's a hero proud to be Jewish. And in Israel, they've sort of held him at arm's length. They haven't given him the weapons he wanted. Maybe Iron Dome is too sophisticated, but they certainly could have used something.
You think it's because if a Jew can become a leader of another country in the world, then maybe Israel isn't as needed? You think that's
Bingo.
part of it? Thinking that?
I'll go even further. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I think Zionism's he's a nightmare for Israel, because
he represents achievement in the assimilated state.
Yeah, it's one thing to achieve, like to in the media, in Hollywood, in politics, whatever, Jews have achieved, and Jews have become oligarchs. I mean, we've achieved in a lot of ways, but not in the way that he's achieved. He's become a Maccabee. His army is taking on Putin, whom the Israelis are afraid to confront.
Yeah,
He's taking on Putin one-on-one, and the Israelis are not. It's like Putin's been taking their lunch money in Syria, and they appear very weak. And Putin, disdains weakness. I mean, he can sniff it out. Israel, in being neutral here, is really, I think, harming themselves. But what happened on Sunday was that it was a beautiful speech, just like Zelensky's been doing for all of these speeches. In Congress, he talked about Pearl Harbor and 9/11, and to the Parliament in London, he talked about Dunkirk. He echoed Churchill's speech. We'll fight them on the hills, we'll fight them on the water, we'll fight them everywhere, and we'll never surrender. I mean, basically, he is Churchill. What he's doing right now. And in the Knesset, he talked about Golda Meir. Born in Odessa, quoted her. Talked about Nachman of Bratslav, which is really interesting because he's great sage buried in Ukraine, and many Jews come to pilgrimage. So he brought up the great Zionist Golda, the great religious leader Nachman of Bratslav, and he compared what's going on right now to the Holocaust, but in ways that were legit. I mean, I think there are really, what's going on is genocide. You can call it anything you want, but he called it the one thing you don't call it: a final solution. So, and I've heard it translated several ways, so I have no idea what he actually said, but it sounds like he said the Russians are trying to do a final solution on the Ukrainian people. And there was such an uproar the next day, even that day, Naftali Bennett, everyone on down in the media, and it's almost like the rest of the speech didn't happen. His cry out from the bunker didn't matter because he used the term final solution, which you should never use. You might be able to compare the Holocaust in some ways, because everyone does, to things going on now, but that's a term you never use. And it's true, you never do. I mean, when there were peace deals on the table with the Palestinians, that was always called final status agreement. You just and final solution would roll off the tongue. It seems like the right thing to say, but then you catch yourself and you say final status. Certain words have gone out of style, and that expression you just don't use. So he made a mistake, but to hit him over the head with it so much just tells me that he really threatens the image of the diaspora Jew being this sort of schlemiel and being, dependent and this is a modern Mordechai. This is a modern Maccabee that we're talking about. He's a real hero, and he didn't move to Israel. His family didn't move to Israel. So that's bringing me right back to where I was a few minutes ago. Israel, is certainly needed by Ukrainian Jews, and it's serving a huge purpose. There might be an aliyah of 100,000 from Ukraine, and probably more from Russia. There are a lot of Jews still in Russia, and that's another reason, by the way, they're trying not to upset Putin. But what's Putin going to do? Treat his people worse than he's treating them? I mean, so the doors may close. I mean, there's such a brain drain happening. I think Putin wants the brains to drain. I think he wants, people to leave who could be trouble for him. But anyway, so did that answer the question? I'm not even sure there was a question. But it is fascinating what's going on, and the whole issue of Israel. It was really about getting back to the Landis versus Art Green argument about whether we need Israel now and how American Jews relate to Israel, it's not on a spiritual level, the way progressives might think. I mean, many of us are upset with Israel's policies. I think it's gotten worse, in fact, with Netanyahu. But I think when it comes down to it, when you see something like this happening, at least for the older generation, I can't speak for young American Jews as much anymore. We see, our gut tells us this is why we need Israel, because of this. We need a place to go when the world is going crazy. Will they all stay? I don't know. They didn't choose to go in the 1990s, but they're going now. If life is good in Israel for them, and they are welcomed, and there are no wars there, which is a very big if, they might, it's going to take a Marshall Plan and a couple of decades to rebuild Ukraine. So, I mean, if I were them, I would stay. You get a nice basket of opportunities and, of financial advantages. I think employment is in a good place in Israel the way it is here right now. You probably can get jobs. Apartments are expensive. But for the most part, if they have money, if they could take money out with them, this population that would be moving from Ukraine has the means to succeed. So that'll change a lot of things in Israel too. You've got a lot of Russian-speaking population there. How will they get along with the Ukrainians? Really interesting. Anyway, was there a comment? Heidi, thank you. Yeah,
I put in the chat, I played this for my class, this song that the little girl, Amelia, sang,
Yes.
Let It Go. And I said, I'm so impressed with the 7-year-old Ukrainian girl who sang Let It Go in the bomb shelter in Ukraine, and then sings the national anthem for thousands in Poland.
Yes.
It was really meaningful, but so I just couldn't believe it. I don't know if everyone has saw that. It's a YouTube video. It's outstanding.
I saw when she first sang in the subway, I guess, in one of the bomb shelters. She first sang it. It was toward the beginning. We're living through some kind of history right now. I don't know if we'll really fully understand it for a long time, but however this is resolved, the world is going to be different afterwards than it was before. So, all right, let me talk a little more about Leonard Fein then, because as I've mentioned, he was all about justice. God, in fact, is social justice to him. And a lot of that comes out of the Holocaust for him too. Let's see if I have to move things around. Here we go. So he did smash a lot of idols. Here we come upon a fourth generation in search of a rationale, an ideology, of a reason to be and to do Jewish. And the fourth generation since the immigration of the early 1900s, from Eastern Europe. And to it we offer instead Judaism as an act of spite. That is, as one version or another of the notion that so long as there are anti-Semites in the world, it would be dishonorable to abandon the Jewish ship. So he's the one who's really, opposing sort of the Holocaust mentality, the victim-based mentality that he saw among a lot of Jews back at that time. So who are the Jews? We are the people who in the 20th century were hunted and hounded and hanged and slaughtered. We are people with tattoos burnt into our forearms. What is all this talk of purpose? We've been bound together in fire. Following Emil Fackenheim, the philosopher, we insist that we will not grant Hitler a posthumous victory, which amounts to saying that so long as there are anti-Semites in the world, we must remain Jews. Why not intermarry? Because of Auschwitz. Why not assimilate? because too much Jewish blood has been spilled. We may march behind the Star of David, but it is the swastika that urges us on. Our vision is not of the end of days, but of the camps. Our slogan is not a blessing, but a curse. Never again. But never again, for all its moral force, is at best a way of telling Jews what to avoid, not what we should embrace. And so he then goes on to say, this is what we should embrace. And what we should embrace is social action. Not why be Jewish, but how to be Jewish. How do we begin to reshape the culture of community? Let there be no mistake, a community that sees itself, or large segments of which see themselves as a community of purpose, it's a community of intention rather than as merely coincidence or a fate, is a very different community from the one we now have. And that's what he is promoting. This next paragraph talks about the how as opposed to the why. So how be Jewish? Jewish action, basically, is what brings Jewish continuity.
Isn't this basically what Reform Judaism has centered itself around for decades?
Yes. And he was a Reform Jew, although as he belonged to my conservative congregation for a while. He became sort of the ideologue of Reform Judaism in many ways, along with Eugene Borowitz, whom we mentioned in a prior episode, who lived in Stamford, you might recall, for a while. But anyway, he's talking about, he's very Zionist in his vision, but that through social action, through unions, he goes into the triangle fire of the early 1900s and some of the ways that Jews have led the way, the Yiddishists, especially in the early part of the century, in the union movements. He was a real believer in that. He says we're not so much building a new Jerusalem in Jerusalem, we can make this a new Jerusalem too. And so that's a key, that the diaspora is viable and important for Jewish survival and continuity. So here, if I can, there's a good summary by the commentator. Fein's insight was twofold. First, he was not panic-stricken by the prophets of doom, who read the future in the National Jewish Population Survey and then dispersed money hither and yon in the service of continuity. Jews were attracted to Judaism when they resonated with its mission. Second, doing justice is central to the mission of Judaism. We were taught, and now we teach, that the question of God is not a question of whether he is jealous, or whether he is a he, or even whether he exists, but of food and of work and of shelter, of love and fidelity and the capacity for wonder. Judaism is a vocation. If not in the services we attend, but the services we perform. Oh, it is not the services we attend, but the services we perform that define us. Question of God is a question of justice. The transcendent is the other, who is beyond my conceptual grasp, and therefore can only be responded to in her vulnerability. However, and this is essential to this point, the reason to do justice is not to attract the youth, not as a continuity program, but because it is right, because it is the answer to the question, what does the Lord your God demand of you? He's just a great writer. That essay, I believe, is a famous one that was taken from, called Judaism is a Verb. And it was formative. Some of you're nodding, Michelle. You've heard that?
I like it. No, I read it and I like it and I agree with it. But then I do know that also in the last decade or two, Reform Judaism found that wasn't enough, because doing good, particularly if it's absent from Jewish values, and often the doing good that the kids are doing or the adults are doing, you could be doing it through other groups, community groups. The whole country is swept up in this idea of doing good. Our kids have community service obligations in the public school. So everybody's trying to do good. And what about it is necessarily Jewish? And so the Reform movement has even gone back to some of the more traditions of trying to, talk about kashrut and Hebrew and rules and Shabbat and stuff, because just doing good wasn't enough. Although I do think, at least in my community, there's a lot more tikkun olam from the Reform congregations that's very, very active than from the others. But there's a gap. There's always a gap.
Well, I think the issue is trying to connect
Right.
those things that are Jewish to those things that are good, because the good, the helping the poor, is Jewish.
Oh, sure, but it's
So-
not always connected.
So breaking the middle matzah, or saying all who are hungry come and eat at the beginning of the Seder, is what connects the Jewish to the good.
Mhm.
And that's what he would say. That there's, it's all about using the Jewish context to create the goodness. That being good for its own sake won't sustain itself, and certainly won't sustain Judaism. But we don't just light Shabbat candles so that the next generation will light Shabbat candles. There has to be a reason for us to do Jewish ritual that leads us to being better people. And that's the hunger that was talked about in the prior chapter that we looked at, that progressive Judaism is built on a search for meaning, a search for purpose, a search for making a better world. And if it has no relevance to that, no connection to that, then it dies at the vine. For Orthodox, you might remember I've talked about the idea God commanded us. That's basically why we do these things, because we're commanded to. Fein is sort of combining the two in that. And he puts his money where his mouth is. He created Mazon. He did all those things. Yeah, it is a little problematic in that many Jews have not made the connection. So maybe let me end with something a little offbeat. But anyone have any other questions?
Yes.
Go ahead, Roz.
I do.
Go.
I think it has something to do with this, but I would like your opinion anyway, and it's somewhat related. What is your opinion of AIPAC endorsing those Republicans who will not condemn what happens at the Capitol?
I think it's reprehensible and dumb. Anything else?
No,
I mean,
no.
if you were AIPAC,
I couldn't get over it. I was so upset.
And the whole purpose, of AIPAC's current incarnation is to eliminate the mistakes of the last 5 years, where it's swayed heavily toward the Republican Party, and and Netanyahu. And so now we don't have Netanyahu. We have Bennett, who's right wing, but he's legit. He's not on trial. That's another thing about Zelensky. He's not on trial. Israelis are jealous of that. They have a leader who's not corrupt. Russians are jealous of that, I think. So, but it's I think AIPAC should not be doing that. Anyone who voted to not accept the election of 2020, forget about whether they protested. I mean, yes, if they were in the Capitol on that day, that wouldn't be good. But except for voting, if they voted to reject those election returns, I wouldn't give them money. This is the first year AIPAC is actually AIPAC. It actually is endorsing and funding candidates. They never did that before. Very dangerous.
Mhm.
I hope they change. And I would love to see them change that, because I think it just hurts them. And I don't think that's good for Israel if they're weak.
Thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't really have time to develop this, but I'll just give you a little quick. There's something called Human Flourishing Movement, sort of, by they came out of Harvard, and the idea is to encourage. Sorry, someone say something. Anyway, it's to see what allows human beings to flourish. Basically, it's fairly simple. So let's see if I can do this. And there are 4 components: family, work, education, and religious community. And these are the ingredients. I won't get into all the numbers and everything, but these are the ingredients, the basic ingredients of what constitutes human flourishing. And the higher, to the extent that, for instance, a religious movement or religious institution gets higher on that scale, the more successful it will be, because it has to answer to people's basic needs. So our basic needs are happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social interconnections. This is this is all about the religious element here, and I'll just read a little part of it. Approximately 84% of the world's population report a religious affiliation. 78% of the US consider religion a very important or fairly important part of their lives. There's a large literature suggesting that attending religious services is associated with better health. Although much of the literature is methodologically weak, there are now numerous well-designed studies that suggest that regular religious service attendance is associated with greater longevity, a 5-fold lower rate of suicide, better survival from cancer, numerous other outcomes. So that's the health aspect. Religious involvement is most strongly predictive of health. It is the communal form of religious practice that appears to bring about better health outcomes. Social interconnection. Numerous studies have also developed an association between attending services and happiness and life satisfaction. Almost all of these are cross-sectional, but the existing longitudinal, that it extends through going back to the people again and again, shows confirmation of this and suggests that it may be causal. There's likewise some evidence from these studies that service attendance is associated with greater meaning in life. With the relationship between religion and virtue, once again, many of the studies use, anyway, we don't need to get to that. The whole point is religion is good. Religion can make an enormous difference in people's lives, allowing them to flourish. Give a sense of meaning, a sense of connection, social connection, a sense of good health, mental health, and ethics of a life worth living. If we do our job right.
Yeah. Can you go back to the diagram
Sure.
that you started with? Because I just wanted to screenshot it.
Yeah, also I am, recording this, Heidi, so I'll send you the link and then you could also come to that spot, pause it.
Okay.
But I'll do that anyway. So you wanted this or the?
No, the first diagram.
Oops, sorry.
That.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So my point of just bringing this up, and this is so superficial. I mean, there's a lot more to it. You should look it up. Flourishing. It's all over the place. That is a trend now, a major trend in terms of religious institutions and movements understanding that we're going to survive, we're going to thrive if we help people to flourish. And this is how we do it. And I think Art Green and Leonard Fein both contribute to that in different ways through character and virtue, meaning and purpose, connection, physical and mental health. But the character and virtue part is where the social action comes in and the justice comes in. And it's not just Judaism, but through Judaism, you gain more than just that. You gain some purpose in life and connection through the centuries, not just horizontally across the world and among other Jews living right now. So is that good, Heidi? You all set?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
I don't know what the numbers mean.
Yeah, I know. You have to read all the literature to know that. I'll send out the link for the initial article that could help. All right, so any questions before we conclude? Any comments? So anyway, great to see all of you. For those who came on a little late, the next session is in 2 weeks. Next week is the prayer vigil for Ukraine and interfaith program that we're going to have through our community at 7 o'clock. It'll be online. 2 weeks will be our last session. So if there's anything else you see in the index or in the table of contents you want to cover, please let me know, and we'll make sure to get it on the agenda.
Okay, great.
Good to see you all.
Okay.
Have a good night. Thanks a lot.
Night.
Bye.
Bye.